letters of January 26th and February 7th in particular. The January 26th letter first, or shall we go straight into the presentation? Straight in? So you don't want to worry about that right now. Good. So we have agreed we'll go straight into your presentation. Petrotrin, could you please introduce the members of your team for the listening public?
Wilfred Espinay, Chairman.
Nigel Edwards, Director.
Renalo Jodi Singh, Deputy Chairman.
Stephen Auer, Vice President, Exploration and Production.
Fitzroy Harewood, President.
From the Ministry of Energy, Selwyn Lashley, Permanent Secretary.
You're not a director of Petrotrin as well?
At this forum, I'm here in my capacity as Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Energy.
Okay.
Penelope Bracho-Nez, Deputy Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Energy.
We have somebody else on the front. Did you give us your position, sir?
Yes, Chair.
What is it again?
Stephen Auer, Vice President, Exploration and Production.
Sharon Morris Cummings, Corporate Secretary.
Anthony Chantak, Director.
Astor Harris, Vice President of Refining and Marketing.
Neil Derrick, Vice President, Human Resource and Corporate Services.
Andre Hossain, Senior Manager, Law and Land Management, Acting.
All right, so not all members of the board, Mr. Espinay, not all members of the board are present.
We have Linda Rajpal, who has asked to be excused as she's not well, Chairman.
And Mr. Nancis?
Couldn't make it.
No,
He's not here either.
No.
And Mr. Harding?
No, they are not. They were not members of it early on.
They were not present in the past.
They were not. They have not been present.
Okay,
as
I'm just trying to clear it up.
This
So
is
that the
fact,
team,
yeah,
the Petrotrin team, the only person that's missing is the lady that you referred to.
Yes, Linda Rajpal.
Okay, fine. That's fine. Great. All right, well, you can go straight into your presentation.
Sure, Chairman. So we have done a presentation on your request from the last meeting. We've entitled it A Way Forward because it's intended to highlight some of the issues, both some of the issues that we found and the way that we're treating with it moving forward. So it is not just by way of introduction. It's not a deep dive into the operational issues at Petrotrin. It's very much an overview of the company, its performance, and the things that we need to see happen.
Sure.
So the first section of it, we just lay some context and give you some background. This board was installed at the company since September of 2017. So we've been in place, I think the official date of the letter was September 4th of 2017. And so for the first 3 months or so, we spent some time trying to get some dimension around what we're looking at. And so the first action that we took was to review the operations of the company. And we did that by looking at two separate parts. Firstly, the upstream activities, which relate to the exploration and production side of the business, and the downstream, looking at the refining and marketing. That's important because when we look at the rest of the presentation, most of the analysis that we do will be on the basis of these two business components. On the upstream side of the business, just by way of background, Petrotrin produces about 43,000 barrels of oil per day and 130 million standard cubic square feet of gas per day. And the company has proven reserves of 140 million barrels of oil equivalent. The refinery is rated to refine 175,000 barrels of oil per day. But we've looked at the last
Could you just repeat that number?
175,000
okay.
barrels per day. But having looked at the last 5 years, on average, we've produced 124,000 barrels per day through the refinery. That is approximately 71% throughput. As we move forward, we have looked at both sides of the business and a couple critical decision points as we move forward, look forward. On the upstream side of the business, we have to take a look at our strategic approach and especially as it relates to optimizing the production. And you'll notice that optimizing is underlined, not necessarily maximizing. I think up to now we have been looking at maximizing oil production. We are trying to shift focus to optimizing the production, especially given that some of the fields are mature, and that results in the lifting costs in some instances being well in excess of the industry averages, and in some instances the lifting cost, the cost of producing a barrel of oil, is higher than what we could sell it for. So optimizing production is critically important moving forward on the E&P side of the business. And on the refining and marketing side of the business, ultra-low sulfur diesel is a critical, we were at a critical decision point with respect to ultra-low sulfur diesel, and that will address some much tighter regulatory requirements that will be enforced as early as 2020. That's important because it requires a significant new investment, and the company has already invested a significant sum in ultra-low sulfur diesel. So the next period of time, this will be a critical decision point for us. In addition to that, we've just looked at some of the upcoming cash demands, and we've just laid them out. The first is in respect of the refinery. On an annual basis, the refinery is required to do what's known in the industry as turnarounds or inspections. In many instances, these turnarounds are either due or overdue. And in order for us to move forward safely, we have to address these to reduce the risk of safety incidents in the refinery. Secondly, I just spoke about the ultra-low sulfur diesel, which we have projected to complete by 2021. Our estimates, based on what we have now, suggest that this would cost somewhere in the region of $300 million to move to completion by this time frame. We have a bond maturing in August of 2019 of $850 million. And finally, the abandonment expenditure that's required to keep us in line with global environmental standards. So this is not an exhaustive list, but these represent some of the most critical upcoming cash demands facing the company. We've gone about looking at the way forward in respect of Petrotrin with one objective in mind. And the objective is simply to secure the economic viability of Petrotrin. We've defined economic viability very simply as being able to produce sustainable positive free cash flows. And so I just wanted to, for the avoidance of doubt, to describe what we define as free cash flows. So we've started with the operating performance of the company. So the free cash flows would be earnings, all earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So the cash earnings of the company, less royalties, which comes straight off the top, and less capital expenditure, which is required to keep the business running. The idea here, of course, is to ensure that this equates Petrotrin to any business, any of its peers. The next thing that we did is we took an approach that's essentially a four-step approach. Firstly, we did an asset review, and we'll see a little bit of the result of that. That is to review the producing assets of the company within its two business units, the upstream and downstream business units. The second step was to build what we refer to as a momentum case. That is to project the future free cash flow of the business for the next 5 years, and that's based on historical and existing operating conditions, assuming that nothing has changed. That gives us a sense of what, if we did nothing, what we would look like over the next 5 years. The next step was to build what we refer to as a full potential case. That is, if we project the future cash flows over the same 5-year period, but this time based on us moving closer towards global operational performance requirements that are consistent with standard good practice across the industry. And like I said, that gave us what we refer to as a full potential case. And then the final step, which pretty much we are in right now, is to explore the strategic choices that would result in the positive free cash flows for the company. Just wanted to share some of the observations that we've seen of the company, observations and challenges over the last 5 or so months that we've been there. The first one is perhaps one that we're most concerned about, and that's the significant health, safety, and environmental exposures that we have both upstream and downstream, which leave all our employees and the wider public at risk. This is a big one that we think we have to get under control. Secondly, sorry?
Sorry, just 1 second, Mr. Edwards. Do you want to wait until they finish or interrupt? Okay. We've decided we'll allow you to finish and then we'll ask questions.
Sure. Thank you. The second observation was when we had 2 entities, we worked very closely with 2 entities in particular, and one of them was a specialist in benchmarking across this industry. And when we looked at the benchmarks, by every single measure that we could measure, this company fell within the bottom quartile of the benchmarks. So just by...
I think we'll have to reverse our decision. What is the benchmark that you're using to come to the conclusion that the company is functioning at the bottom of the 4th quartile of the industry?
Sure. And that would be anything from the turnaround expenditure, capital expenditure.
I think, Mr. Edwards, the question being asked is you made a comment a short while ago that you use 2 particular entities, two consultants or whatever. So you need to tell us who they are. And then Senator Ramdeen's specific question, if I understand it, is whenever you're benchmarking, you have to benchmark against a certain measurement, a certain level. So can you just give us some more detail on that, please?
So, yeah, so the 2 firms that we worked together with, so we worked with McKinsey. McKinsey are strategic consultants, and the specialist benchmarkers are Solomon and Associates. Just to make the point that we've used those as inputs into our decisions and observations. So what you'll see throughout here is not a reproduction necessarily of their work, but we've used their work to advise and to help us to decide to make decisions.
Which is the right way to do it, if I may interrupt you again. Now, McKinsey, I think we're all familiar with, right? Because McKinsey are recognized as an international management consultant specialist, and in various fields, etc. They have specialists that they can come in, do a review, and assist you in pinpointing areas. But Solomon, you say you use Solomon from a benchmarking. I mean, I don't think anyone here on the committee has been in the industry. Who is Solomon? Where is Solomon an international? And when you say benchmarking against what? Is it that they collect data from all over the world, etc., and then you kind of plug into where you...
Yeah, so Solomon and Associates is a global firm that do exactly as you've discussed. They collect data from, especially in the oil and gas industry, from global players. In our instance, they've benchmarked us using refineries and exploration and production companies, both within our region, within Latin America, and also within the Gulf Coast of the U.S. So when we talk about the benchmarking, it is they've benchmarked us primarily against the Latin American entities.
And comparing apples and apples, of course. That's always one of our concerns with benchmarking. So they would have looked at presumably the size of refinery,
exactly.
the throughput of...
complexity of the refinery, correct. So size, complexity, like for like, and compared us across the region, please.
Chairman, just so you could understand it, what had in fact been the focus of the board is to establish what is it going to require for us to be competitive in the marketplace that we operate in? And so what we wanted to do was to find measurements in terms of how we compare with people who operate in the same environment. And while you may want to say that is apples exactly with apples, if in the final analysis it is the same products that we're making, operating in the same marketplace. As you will appreciate, a substantial part of the product that is refined in Trinidad and Tobago has to be exported outside of Trinidad and Tobago, as we don't use all of it. And that means, therefore, that the markets that we operate in, we have to be competitive in them. So,
and understood. I wasn't trying to pin you down to perfect apples and apples is 175.
but essentially, yes.
But essentially, you'd have to fall in the same category.
Yes, and they have taken into consideration that because they've gone through tier by tier of job activities and what they're doing. Yes. And
you all were satisfied with the product that they produced for you and the benchmarking that they did?
Well, I think that we are as satisfied as one would be with somebody of that reputation. These are the leaders of this particular field of endeavor.
One quick question. When you went in there as a board, presumably one of the things that I assume you did, and you could confirm whether you did it or not, is you would have done an assessment of the number of reports that would have been produced over the years for Petrotrin by a number of consultants. Was there a similar benchmarking exercise that had been done within recent time?
Well, in fact, and the president could reinforce this, this set of benchmarkers have been in the company on more than one occasion in the past. And I think that essentially they have done a number of specific jobs. What we particularly focused on was the company's activities as they are today in relation to how its competitiveness is in the use of and in the practices that it is involved in, and the use of manpower and the practices of the organization.
Okay.
So, Minister, if I may, just sensing the line of questioning, if I may just go on to the next few points and then pause.
You go on.
And then I'll pause and we'll come right back to that question.
I'd like to put on the record, while you all were talking, I did a little research. And it is alleged that Solomon Associates is the leading performance improvement company for the global energy industry. Would you say that's fair?
That's true. Correct.
And that they provide benchmarking solutions across the energy value chain?
Correct.
From upstream to downstream? So you are using the best available expertise to benchmark Petrotrin's performance?
Chairman, in each case, the board took the decision that it was going to take the best in class in both, in anybody that they were dealing with, so that we could stand scrutiny in going forward with these projects.
Fine. So based on the fact that you're using the world leader in benchmarking in the energy sector, they have told you that Petrotrin is functioning within the bottom of the fourth quartile. Now, in layman's language, does that mean the bottom of the bottom?
It does.
So it is the lowest of the low.
Correct.
So Petrotrin is functioning in the lowest of the low in the energy industry.
Correct.
According to Solomon Associates.
According to both McKinsey and Solomon Associates. All right, so. Sorry.
Mr. Edwards and to the chairman, just building on what Minister Young had asked about the fact that these benchmark firms that you have employed now, since you have become the new board, have been doing work for Petrotrin previously. Did your inquiry discover for how long Petrotrin has been in the fourth quartile of the industry?
Mr. Randin, is it okay for us to come back to responding to that in a few minutes?
Move along.
Sure. Yeah, so other observations. We've seen an inability to manage and execute major projects to deliver results within budget and on time. And I know that's been the subject of conversation in this place before. And that's resulted in the past in consistent and significant cost overruns that have been value destructive. We've seen challenges in implementing improved operating practices that need to be in place in order to have sustained positive value creation. And finally, and this is where I want to get back to the question, we've seen for decades, our observation is that there's been a culture of what some of those very reports refer to as a culture of complacency and comfort with the status quo. And just to highlight that, we've just taken a quotation from one of those studies that dates all the way back to 2006. And I'll just read a quotation from that there's an urgent need, since 2006, that there's an urgent need to increase the performance of the refinery and to embrace and to reinforce the required changes throughout Petrotrin's corporate management in order to achieve and maintain a prolonged positive cash flow. A changed corporate mindset and a reinforcement of management focus are an absolute prerequisite to realize the necessary improvement. Petrotrin will need inspiration, motivation, and consistent leadership to achieve the required performance and must convince all staff of the sense of urgency to reduce costs and to improve performance. This 2006 study was done by another firm that pointed out some of the same challenges that we refer to. Whether you looked at throughput, whether you looked at the non-energy operating costs, the benchmarks all indicated that we were in the bottom of the fourth quartile since then. So to respond to your question, this is not new. We appreciate the fact that this has been ongoing. We appreciate the fact that these conditions have prevailed for a long time. But we also appreciate the fact that something radical has to happen to change and to bring about that change. All right. In terms of analyzing the past, we've looked at the free cash flows of the company over the last 5 years. And the picture of the company, suppose on the one hand, is a little bit encouraging in the sense that the free cash flows over the last 5 years has been positive $270 million US. The good news is that the exploration and production side of the business has generated $920 million in positive cash flows over that 5-year period. Bad news is that the refining and marketing section of the business has depleted cash of $650 million over that same time period.
Just let me come in here, Mr.
Sure.
Edwards. When you use the 5-year period as your reference, I assume that's up to the end of 2017, am I correct?
September 2017, correct.
That would include some bad years in terms of oil prices and so on.
Yes, but to make a couple points, so certainly on the refining side, the refinery is a margin business. So it's...
No, I'm talking about the exploration and production.
Absolutely. So, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
so
even in some bad years of the exploration and production, I suppose the point you're making is that had the prices been better, the positive...
It would have been better.
Exactly.
Okay, all right.
All of these figures that are here are in US?
US dollars, correct. So we have seen some improvements on the R&M side, and in particular over the last 2 years, 2016 and 2017, the refining and marketing side of the business has generated roughly $40 million per year of positive free cash flows. But having said that, that is the result of what we consider to be unsustainably low maintenance capex, and of course that backs into some of the same issues that we spoke about a little bit earlier: the turnaround issues not being dealt with, and the exposure.
Which is the point I wanted to make, Mr. Edwards. So for the public looking on, is it not accurate then to say that, I mean, we're dealing with cash flows, so they need to understand the cash flows. This is the intake and outflow of cash flow for Petrotrin, and in particular R&M. What is R&M?
Refining and marketing.
Right. And you're saying that the reason it may have shown certainly a lower amount of deficit, if that's the right term to use, is because they weren't spending the money on asset integrity, which is what we started off by discussing, that you all came in and met. And that, of course, is an accounting measurement, that the cash flow.
Correct.
All right?
Correct.
But you all have a concern, as we all do in the country, about the amount of turnaround or the lack of turnaround that has taken place, my understanding is for quite some time now.
There are some, sorry.
Some of the issues that will come out of that lack of spend is going to be the asset integrity that that has been challenged in the company and has been part of the discussion that has been going on.
Penny wise, pound foolish.
Now, there's also, I don't know if anybody kind of picked up on it, but in the free cash flow that we've been talking about, we're talking free cash flow, and earlier on in defining it, it does not include your interest charges or your repayment of debt. Okay, so
Does it include, when Petrotrin uses this terminology of free cash flow, from the government side, and in particular the chairman, who's the Minister of Finance?
It does the royalties.
It does include, it includes payment of royalties?
Royalties.
So it does include the payment of royalties in there?
That's right.
Let me just clarify that, because in your presentation, you have defined free cash flow as earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, less royalties, less capital expenditure.
Correct. So free cash flows takes account of the fact that we have already paid royalties, not taxation, but royalties.
Where are you seeing that definition?
It's here.
Okay, next set. Okay.
So you are saying that you have been told, or the information presented you as a board, is that over the last 5 years, the company generated free cash flow in the exploration and production section after paying royalties?
So after the royalties that they have paid. So this deals with actual cash flows, actual free cash flows.
Okay, so it's the actual royalties that you have paid?
Correct.
Because there's quite a large sum that has not been paid.
There is some.
I think that we have to please let us not try to take this and apply it to current situations. I'll explain that. This reflects a period of activity and a period of time that we have the results of, and this goes up to September. The situation with the current payment of royalties would include from September to the last quarter would be what is reflected as being royalties that are outstanding. Am I right, Petra? As well?
There's some previous royalties.
And there may be some overlap from the previous period, but this has nothing to do with what you paid, particularly. Thing. This is after the payment of royalties. We're looking at a statistical issue here, and you're looking at an accounting issue, which is two separate things.
Correct.
Right, but I think what we are grappling with, I as Minister of Finance, I have information given to me by the public servants, which tell me that the debt owed by Petrotrin to the Treasury is approaching $3 billion, which is made up of many things. It's made up of petroleum profits tax, of royalties, of supplementary petroleum tax, and other taxes. But there's a substantial arrears of royalties inside there, so that I could say, speaking for myself, and I got the impression other members as well, a little confused that your definition of free cash flow assumes payment of royalties, but you owe the Treasury royalties, so you didn't pay them.
Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. So, Minister, I think the only point you're making is that, sorry, Chairman, the only point you're making is that if Petrotrin had paid all of the royalties that were due to the Treasury, that $270 million of positive free cash flow would be even lower. I think that, and we accept that. So this reflects the actual payments that have been made over this period of time.
That definition of free cash flow, and I'm not casting any aspersions at the current board, is a Petrotrin definition. In other words, you have this cash flow after you paid the royalties that you chose to pay.
Well, I understand why you would say that way. So,
not the royalties that were due and payable.
Not all that were due, correct.
But it is what you paid, is what you had left.
Correct.
But you didn't pay all of the royalties.
Correct, exactly.
So this is a Petrotrin definition of free cash flow, a unique definition.
I would accept that as the
Okay.
definition. Yeah.
But Ms. Edwards, the difficulty with that, adopting that approach, is that it doesn't give us a reality check of actually what is happening with respect to Petrotrin, which is what we want and the public of Trinidad and Tobago needs to understand.
So, and the way forward, and that's, so what we have to do now is what we need to do, so we've given you the history. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to take you to the next 5 years and the way forward. And to be very clear that we have included all of the payments that are due to the state and everybody else as part of the free cash flow. I couldn't come here and create numbers that didn't exist. So I could only give you history based on the history that is real and that we experienced.
I understand, but I think it's necessary for the public to understand.
Absolutely.
Because they are all different types of members of the public listening to us now. And some members of the public might say, oh, Petrotrin generated positive cash flow of 920 million in exploration and production, therefore Petrotrin has money, and then there will be all sorts of consequences. But I think the public needs to know as a fact, factually, that these numbers do not take into account taxes and royalties that were not paid by Petrotrin to the state, so that if you took into account those liabilities, the free cash flow would be less.
Correct.
And I think the public needs to know that.
Correct.
Okay? Well, Mr. Young is saying the comrades need to know this, that these numbers don't take into account the debt owed by Petrotrin to the state with respect to arrears of royalties and taxes, which, as I said, the last number I got, it was over 2 billion, closing in on 3 billion.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Chairman. So if I were to look forward, like I said, we've, on the E&P side, the upstream side of the business, exploration and production side of the business, we built out what I had referred to as a momentum case. We looked at some opportunities and then came up with a full potential. On the upstream side of the business, if we assume that there was no significant operational change within the next 5 years, then the projected free cash flows of this business would be negative $55 million.
When you say no significant operational changes, that means keeping exploration and production as is. So it's mature fields we're dealing with, no new drilling of areas, no investment in CapEx upstream.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
That this number of minus 55 million, yes, I'm coming to that, assumes that you would pay your taxes.
It does.
And your royalties.
Assumes that we're paying royalties. So this is before the payment of taxes. And
so it assumes that the company is not paying supplementary petroleum tax.
So, yeah, and there's a specific...
Could I just get clarity on that?
Correct.
It assumes you are not paying supplementary petroleum tax.
Correct. And there's a specific reason for us stopping the free cash flows at that point. It simply allows us to compare ourselves with companies globally and without any of the anomalies of taxation regimes in different countries. That's what that does. So essentially, if you were looking at any company, and it's not uncommon to look at free cash flows in this way in any industry, whether this industry, if you're looking at manufacturing, it's not uncommon. And the idea is to compare yourselves across industries, to be able to compare yourselves across geography. And this says, in order for you to be able to pay taxes and to be able to service your debt and to be able to service the providers of capital, you need to be providing positive free cash flows. So the idea is to get to the stage where you have not negative, not only break even, but where you have positive free cash flows. It's the only way you will be able to pay your taxes and service the providers of your capital, whether debt or equity.
You're assuming that royalty is an inescapable expense?
Correct. It's extractive.
And SPT is not?
Well, SPT, I mean, Mr. Chair, I was just thinking that through. Am I not correct? There are two types of taxes that you'll be subjected. Tax on profit, all right? So Petrotrin has to be profitable to pay your income tax on profit. I know.
PPT.
But then also with the SPT as well, it would have to be over $50 a barrel.
Yeah.
So was it that in the projections here and when this was done, they were using a projected cost of less, But then I didn't interrupt because you were saying that this is also done in manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. So I figured you all just backed out all taxes, and SPTs are tax specific. Barrels of oil over $50 is when it kicks in.
Right, and the whole point of doing free cash flows to this level is to remove any anomalies in taxation structures.
All right.
So exactly for that reason.
Mr. Edwards, supplemental petroleum tax when the oil price reaches a certain level, or when a factor reaches a certain point, is commonplace in the oil industry all over the world.
It is, but at different levels. So there are different levels of taxes, different structures.
I accept that, but a supplementary petroleum tax, which is really a windfall tax when oil prices are high, that is standard throughout the world in oil-producing regions. So that why isn't Petrotrin using the world standard for the energy sector in terms of your free cash flow?
So this actually is a methodology that's applied across industry. It's not specific to the energy industry. It's not specific, and so we should be able to compare the cash flows generated by Petrotrin as an oil and gas company with the cash flows generated by an entity that's with Kraft that's producing food, for example, both of which have very different taxation structures, but we try to normalize the free cash flows outside of the tax regime for the industry.
Understand that oil taxation is unique.
Understood.
And that there are different types of taxes, and a supplementary petroleum tax is a volume-based tax, which bears no relationship to profitability. And a petroleum profits tax is a profits-based tax, and volume-based taxes are commonplace throughout the world. So I'm a little confused as to why Petrotrin would not use the energy standard for its free cash flow and use a manufacturing standard instead.
Well, it's not so much a manufacturing standard, it's just using a global standard for free cash flow.
But for companies that are not in the energy sector.
For companies, period.
I was just going to interrupt. I mean, I'm not an accountant, but I think what you've been trying to get across to us is understand there are a number of different measurement tools when looking at businesses you use for accounting and projections. Free cash flow is one.
Correct.
And in the formula of analyzing free cash flow, you back out taxes.
For any industry, including oil and gas.
Understood.
I think, Chairman, that as an investor, one looks at it in that, as an investor, purely as an investor. Right. Not as an industry, but as an investor. But I just want to make 2 points that I think may be valid. I don't have the exact information here, but McKinsey did identify a projected cost of a barrel of oil, a price of barrel of oil in their exercise. Do you have it in the thing there?
What they based these numbers? They based it on between $56 and $60 in different years. So 56,
okay.
56.
So that there's a price at which they base their projections. And I think that that's part of the predicament that you're faced with. It is certainly less than what is existing in the last 2 or 3 months. Yeah, and because I think that it was between 56 and 60, but they must have had a number. But
yeah,
okay,
they've done it year by year.
Can I ask, therefore, is the assumed price for your projections below $50?
No,
So
it starts off at it starts off at $56 in years 1, 2, and 3, and it goes up to.
So it's
$60
above
by 5.
the threshold for the
SPT
application of the supplementary petroleum tax.
Correct.
And would you agree that royalty, being a percentage of price and volume, is identical to SPT being a percentage of price and volume?
Yes.
And therefore, why would you include royalty, because it's based on volume, and not include SPT, which is also based on volume?
Yeah, and Chairman, it's only a standard way of looking at it. I'm sure, we can get the consultants to include SPT.
I think
it would just be an alternative view.
I think you should, for the benefit of the public.
Sure.
Because SPT is real.
Sure.
It's other companies are paying SPT at this time, and I mean that's a tremendous benefit for the country. And I'm not aware that Petrotrin is paying SPT. They may be, but as far as I know, they are not. So that should be factored into the calculations. Okay? Thanks.
Sure. Okay. So certainly based on the definition, we'll start off at minus $55 million in free cash flows. But that's, if we look at some of the opportunities to improve that, we can move towards positive free cash flows in this area by improving production uptime and increasing the workover activity in this side of the business. We have to make some better and high-grade well choices and to improve the capital expenditure discipline, ensuring that when we invest in a particular well, that there's a minimum return on investment per well, and be very disciplined about doing that.
Mr. Edwards, I hate to stop you.
Sure.
When you're in full flight. But I was looking at these words, CapEx return discipline, and I get the impression that CapEx return discipline is not really present at Petrotrin.
You know, again, this is something that was explored at, I think maybe at the last or maybe previous meeting where we looked at some spend, I think in that instance, over $1.2 billion spend that we have not seen return on. You know, it's not, and this is some of the history that we went back to. So some of the capital discipline, CapEx discipline, in fact, is not there.
Would it be fair to say that a lot of money has been spent by Petrotrin and the returns have not justified the expenditure? Would it be fair to say that?
I think it would be fair to say that.
Could that be partly or wholly due to a lack of CapEx return discipline?
I think that's a fair conclusion, yes.
And could you put that into layman's language? What is CapEx return discipline?
It's this spending on capital expenditure is spending on either infrastructure, plant, right, to ensure that the future viability of the company.
So CapEx return discipline would be an effort, a regime with an intention to ensure that the money that you spend on upgrading your infrastructure and your equipment produces a positive return.
Exactly. So it's a capital expenditure discipline says if I spend $100, I need to know how I'm going to get back a minimum of $110 in exchange for that.
Just to build on what the Minister of Finance has just asked you, you know, what really stands out when you look at 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 things that you flagged as opportunities under the heading of opportunities? In any business,
standard operating practice.
These are standard operating practices.
Agreed.
These are the fundamental pillars upon which any business that wants to be profitable and efficient will have as part of their operations.
Agreed.
So basically, what we are saying is that Petrotrin has been operating for a significant period of time, to use layman's language so that people will understand, like a runaway train, with absolutely no discipline in terms of their operations.
So, Mr. Ramdeed, what I can do, I can tell you what we have found. Even if I don't put it in those words.
Well, let's put it the other way, Mr. Edwards, so that people will understand. Improve production uptime, capital expenditure discipline, maintenance expenses to best in class, implement activity reduction, reduced overtime, and bring drilling costs in line with markets. The flip side of what you are saying here by presenting this to us is that none of these things,
are not in place,
right, have been in the existence of Petrotrin over this period of time until your board has looked at it. The question that the question that the public and the Minister of Finance, who is Corporation Solo, is going to ask is simply this: well, if this is what has been going on at Petrotrin, why has it been going on for so long? And has anyone been held responsible? Because Petrotrin as an organization that is set up, $1 billion organization that is set up to be run by taxpayers' dollars. And at the end of the day, somebody has to be held responsible for these things having taken place. And if no one has been held responsible, then somebody has a serious dereliction of duty in terms of what transpired or what has been transpiring at Petrotrin. You've been there only for 5 months. So those really are the questions that the public, and I expect the Minister of Finance, those are the questions that we really would want answers to. I'm happy to understand that, this is the way forward. But at the end of the day, we can't just cut loose from what has transpired in the past and say, let's move forward, without at some point in time somebody being held accountable for this state of affairs.
Well, I wonder if I might just interject, Chairman. Senator Ramdeen, I want you to know that this is not unique to Petrotrin, so sometimes I'm somewhat surprised when I hear the kind of response that you have come up with, because I am sure that this permeates through almost every single state enterprise. There is a problem, and it has been a disconnect where people don't see that there is a commercial activity here at all. They see it as an extension of the state, and therefore they live with it in that it will be saved with whatever it's done, it will exist. And that is the predicament that the board finds itself in now. How do we change that mindset? How do we get people on board to change their habits, their work habits, their systems? I mean, I'm flabbergasted at times when you listen and you hear that you may have 14% absenteeism in an enterprise. That doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. 3% is considered to be exorbitant, and we have. I was listening on television when somebody said that 20% of the police force didn't turn up on Carnival Day, and that's absenteeism, and those are sorry to cross, but
I think we need to return to the subject at hand, and Senator Ramdeen asked a specific question. Would anybody be held accountable for all of this?
Well, Chairman, it is not the purview of the board to interfere with somebody who went before, certainly. We are focused on where do we take this operation so that we can make it viable.
I don't know, Mr. Chairman, if that might be the mindset of the present board that has come into operation 5 months ago. But to say that you divorce yourselves from what may have taken place and has cost Petrotrin and the taxpayers of Trinidad and Tobago significant losses, I don't think one can simply say that one can simply say that you're not responsible for it and we're not going to hold anybody accountable.
No, Senator Ramdeen, I don't. That's not what I heard the chairman say. I think, just to be clear, what we are focused on and what will happen is that these things will be implemented. As a consequence of that, there'll have to be some radical change in what you will not see is the accustomed or status quo that we went back to in that comment.
Let me just intervene here.
Sure.
I think, Senator Ramdeen, I think the board has answered you. You may not be satisfied with the answer.
I'm fine with that.
You're okay with the answer?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
We move on now, please.
Sure, thank you. So just if and when we implement these changes, we've given it an 18-month period, because obviously some of these things, and Senator Ramdeen, by the way, some of these things we accept it won't be easy. We're not saying that it will be easy to implement some of these things, because these are practices that have been in place for decades. And so we've given it an 18-month transition window. And so once that's implemented within the next 18 months, over the coming 5 years, this will result in cumulative free cash flows of positive $1.2 billion over the next 5 years. So it's a fairly dramatic shift from the minus 55 million projected if business as usual persists to when we implement these, what we will be able to generate.
But this is what you are calling a full potential case?
Full potential case, correct.
So there are options then?
So
I'm looking in the presentation, I'm seeing other options.
So certainly on the ENP side, the full potential assumes that you are able to do all of these 5 and to do them well. You may not be, if for whatever reason there's resistance to any one of these, so reducing non-energy cost, for instance, if there's resistance there, you may not be able to get to the full 1.2 billion, but certainly if you implement, even if you implement some of these, you will get to positive free cash flows. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, Mr. Edwards and to the chairman, that 1.2 billion and your plan, full potential case over the next 18 months, that assumes that this is assuming that you're able to implement all of these.
That's correct, yes.
Has any analysis been done with respect to what is the reality or what is realistic in terms of achieving these?
Well, Senator Ramley, if they are going to present the same presentation I have, they have do nothing option, and then they have a partial option.
No.
Are you going to present this?
No, you may have a different presentation.
Just one second. This losses and momentum. You see? Yeah, well, what I have, I mean, you can correct me.
The next slide.
The next slide.
Well, that is.
Oh, the next slide over is
I call
refining
do
and
nothing.
marketing. So I'll come to that.
Oh, that's R&M.
That's R&M.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
yes.
My apologies.
Sure.
So you're saying that on the exploration side, you have this plan, and if you
Yes.
do it, you could achieve the free cash flow of
1.2
Petrogen
billion.
free cash flow of 1.2 billion.
Correct.
Unique Petrogen free cash flow.
Which,
So the-
by the way, Chairman, if you generate 1.2 billion, it certainly allows you to pay SPT and other taxes.
part of it.
But perhaps I don't know if Senator Randin's question is whether or not we have done sensitivity analysis on each element that we have talked about. And Senator Ramdin, the objective of the board is to implement all of them at that level. So there is no intent to put it at a different level and work out sensitivities in that at this stage.
But, Mr. Chair, there must be, this is your best case scenario, having regard to your projected plan.
No, but best case being achievable best case.
Correct. Achievable best case.
Achievable best case.
Realistic best case.
Okay?
Okay.
That's a
Understood.
realistic best case, and that's what we are using as where we want to go.
Okay. All right. So on the R&M side, on the downstream side of the business, so we've done essentially the same thing. The momentum case on this side of the business, and if you remember, the momentum case is what would happen over the next 5 years if you assume there are no significant operational changes. In this case, in R&M, the best case over the next 5 years is for projected free cash flows of minus $923 million. Given that that assumes that when we do projects such as the ultra-low sulfur diesel, that assumes that everything happens on time and within budget. Because we know that that's not been the experience, and we adjust for what is likely to be the experience, the sort of realistic 5-year projection would take us closer to $1.4 billion negative cash flows. If we spend on some of those projects and they go over budget as in line with history. Yes.
Can I just interrupt? So if you are very successful with your improvement of exploration and production and generate $1.2 billion in cash flow, that will all be wiped out by negative cash flow in the refinery.
If we do nothing.
If you do nothing.
Correct, exactly.
So if you are able to achieve what you plan to achieve with the production, 1.2 billion in positive cash flow, and if you can't get anything done or don't do anything with the refinery, minus 1.4.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. Having said that, there are some opportunities on the R&M side of the business as well, on the refining side. Firstly, to improve the operational efficiency, again, by focusing on non-energy costs to within at least the second quartile when compared to our industry peers. The second line, to bring about improvement in the refinery throughput. The refinery throughput, if you remember, from my earlier slide, I said was about 71%. Second quartile performance takes you to above 92%. And so we're saying if we can get to 92% or better, that gives us a fighting chance. To improve the turnaround capex, on average, turnarounds are done on about 4 years. The last turnaround activity at this company was 6 to 7 years ago. So those, and that leads to some of the health and safety issues or risks that we see. And finally, to optimize the crude and the yield so that we can improve gross refinery margin by about 75 cents a barrel. If we can implement those changes, then there will be significant improvements. It won't get us the dramatic results as we have in the exploration and production, but at least we'll get to a break-even level. And to stress the point that has been made so many times here, a break-even with respect to free cash flow here means that you're breaking even and before being able to pay taxes or to service the providers of your capital. So that's it's actually a very important point, but at least it doesn't get you into much deeper losses than that. So in terms of some of the next steps or where we are right now, over the last 2 months in particular, we have been focusing our efforts on stakeholder engagement, and we recognize that partnership is required amongst all of the stakeholders if we are to bring any layer of transformation into viability. The board has been actively engaging all of the stakeholders with a view to enacting a very collaborative approach toward viability. We've been building what we refer to as a critical coalition amongst the shareholders. So we've engaged the shareholder. We have actively engaged not just the trade union, but also the management and the employees of the company to get their partnership, and have been in active discussions with the financiers, just ensuring that they're... Sorry, Chair.
Take a pin here, Mr. Edwards. So, you are saying that if you achieve all of the objectives here, the best that could happen is that you would break even on the refinery?
Yes.
And could you then explain what does improve operational efficiency, non-energy costs mean?
Our operating costs, which includes everything from the support systems that go into to refining and marketing, to whether that's if I were to go back to the benchmarking exercise, Solomon very carefully benchmarked us with not even the best in class in some instances, just the average. And some of what they refer to as the superstructure associated with our operations inflated compared to the costs of, and that's everything from contractual contracts to for maintenance, the employee and related expenditure,
Okay.
all of the anything
so
that's
non-energy costs is every cost other than purchasing crude.
Correct.
Energy costs is purchase of crude oil.
Correct, yes.
And non-energy is everything else.
Everything else.
So that's goods and services and personnel expenditure.
Correct.
So so that in order to break even, you must improve efficiency with respect to your expenditure on goods and services and personnel to the second quartile from where it is, somewhere down by the bottom of the lowest
The fourth
quartile.
quartile.
So that's what that means.
That's correct.
And if you are not able to achieve operational efficiency on the non-energy side, you would not break even.
Correct. So again, to Senator Ramdi's earlier point, this assumes that we are able to implement all of these. So to Senator Ramdi's earlier point, which is that if we applied sensitivity to this, you won't even get to break even. And we do have those sensitivity numbers in detail, but it's not, I don't think it's necessary for, it's a necessary level of detail for this.
Okay. And this very difficult proposition of getting to break even with doing all these things, Is that because of the debt load associated with the refinery?
Well, it includes a debt load. Sorry. Let me start before. This is before tax, before the cost of financing.
I know. I just want everybody else to know that.
So
I know that.
Okay,
That
so
all
that
of this
you have to
has nothing to do with
understand
debt
that there is
servicing.
Chairman, you have to understand that what this is talking about is cash flow. It has not included in it depreciation, nor anything to do with the repayment of debt.
I
So
know.
those are two
I
other
want the public
burdens
to
that
know
have
that.
to be done. Yeah.
So that this projection that if you do all of these operational improvements, you would get free cash flow, but you would still have your debt servicing, which would then send you into
correct.
negative territory.
Correct, yes.
Even with all of these improvements you're making here, you're still in negative territory when you bring into book your debt service payments and your depreciation and so on. Okay? But again, I would ask, therefore, is we need to get an understanding of what that means. Because if, let's assume you can do this, you can break even, but what kind of burden on the company is your debt service and so on with respect to the refinery? No. It doesn't have it, no. Well, ask the question.
Mr. Edwards, I've just taken one step ahead and looked through the presentation as to what is to come. And there are two questions I want to ask. The first, probably more important, the second. There's no part of the presentation where you incorporate the reality of what we speak about in terms of debt financing and the expenditure that needs to be incurred or has to be mandatorily incurred over the next 5-year period by Petrotrin. Are you going to give details of that so that when we take the perfect case, which you have outlined as to the next 5 years in terms of your projection or your board's projection, we can match it back against the reality of Petrotrin and then come back to where we really are?
As Senator Ramdin, the reality is that unless you make the changes, you can't go forward. That's a reality. In other words, to go projecting down the road is an academic exercise. You would appreciate that if you're in a break-even position, okay, and let's say that you made no changes either way, and you're in a break-even position, and you want to add to that the cost of interest and depreciation, etc., it only reflects something that is untenable anyway, even at its existing position.
No, but Mr. Chair, that obviously is the position that Petrotrin, as we speak now, is in an untenable position. We are in degrees of how untenable it can get. And in order for the public to understand how untenable the position can be without the changes, I think it's important for us to understand, firstly, this is your best case. If your board is able to implement all of these things, this is where Petrotrin can be in 5 years. One has to also understand, if the board, when you match that, this does not take into consideration certain factors that we've already outlined. Though it will be unrealistic for the public to know that your best case scenario doesn't take into consideration debt repayment, taxes and royalties that are owed to Petrotrin. So that while it might be a very untenable position on your best case scenario, the public still needs to know how untenable it is.
Senator Chairman, essentially what we are describing is a situation where if nothing happens at this company, over the next 5 years, we are staring at minus $1.5 billion in cash flow, free cash flows. So that's a starting position. We're seeing, and that's even before servicing debt. So that's minus $1.5 billion just from operations. We're seeing there's a package of changes that can turn that around. And if that happens, we can generate positive $1.2 billion over the next 5 years. And Senator Ramdin, the only point, I think the point that you're making is that $1.2 billion then has to do several things. It has to service your taxes and the providers of your capital. Because we do, we've been talking about the providers of capital as if they're only debt holders. But every citizen of Trinidad and Tobago is also a provider of capital. And I would expect that dividends is a requirement or an expectation of this company. So the point you're making is we have to get to the point where not only is Petrotrin able to pay its taxes, service its debt, but also to be able to pay dividends and to give a return to its shareholders. The reason we've put 5 years as a realistic period, it's easy to project into 5 years with some degree of realism. We know it's going to take some time for us to implement these things, therefore the 18 months. And so $1.2 billion, we are comforted is enough to service taxes and to service the debt. The how is something that we will come to, and that's something that we have committed to share with other stakeholders within 60 days from today. We've met with our lenders, as we've said. We've told them that within 90 days of meeting with them, which was about a month ago, that we will come to them with some prioritized plans, and that's something that we are required to do. Otherwise, we're not going to be in a position to get the comfort from lenders who are a critical part of Petrotrin's future. And so we think that being able to generate positive cash flow is critically important for us to present to them, and the how that cash flow is distributed between the state in the form of taxes and the providers of capital is something, a detail we'll get to.
Thank you, Chair. To Mr. Edwards, I just want to go back a bit and using the definition of the free cash flows, 2013 to 2017, I just need your clarification and help me. The company Petrotrin has been having overall 2013-2017, that 5-year period, a $270 million overall positive cash flow. Fair?
Correct.
So the company, using the definition of free cash flow, Petrotrin, has not been performing bad in relationship to that definition.
Well, so
because that's the definition we're playing around here this afternoon with.
I understand that, but I do want to take cognizance of the chairman's earlier comment that if Petrotrin had paid all its royalties.
No. You carry me down a road. I don't want to go down that road yet. I just want to stay with what is in front of me. Free cash flows for the 5-year period, 2013 to 2017. Petrotrin has had a $270 million positive cash flow. Fair? Based on this.
That's a fact, yes.
Right. And that's based on another assumption on my part, that Petrotrin had all these issues that you have outlined here, which Senator Ramdeen talked about, standard operating procedures of any business to survive. So under the worst conditions, for the last 5 years, 2013 to 2017, Petrotrin generated free cash flows using that definition of $270 million. What this new board is assuming now, for the next 5 years, assuming no significant operational changes, status quo remains as 2013 to 2017. You have now come up with an assumption of negative $55 million in free cash flows. Fair? And correct. I'm trying to correlate what would cause that negativity and put Petrotrin in that negative light, where under the worst conditions of 2013 to 2017, you had all these negative things going on in Petrotrin. So I'm a little bit...
I understand. So
could you, for the public listening, because if...
And I understand completely where you're coming from. So there are two things that happened over that 2013 to 2017 period. One is something that we said before. If we had paid all our royalties and taxes when they became due, we wouldn't have positive 270. The future is projecting that we will pay those taxes, the royalties when they become due. So that's point number one.
Well, okay, let me just add. Then you're changing the definition of your free cash flows in your assumption of the next 5 years, because your 2013-2017 assumption, you had a 270 positive cash flow, and you're saying let us maintain status quo, let us not change any assumptions, and now you have come up and you used a benchmark of oil between $56 to $60, correct?
Correct. So
I'm a little bit, because I have an assumption in my mind where this is going. Huh?
yeah, so as Your Honor, earlier I said that when I cannot make up the numbers for the history. So I couldn't come here and say to you that if we had paid for the past 5 years, this is what our free cash flow would have been. Having said that, going forward, as a responsible company, we can only project based on what we, as a responsible corporate citizen, ought to be doing, which includes the payment of royalties. So it's not changing the definition, but I can't go back and redefine reality. I can't change the facts over the last 5 years.
All right, let me put it another way. The general public is listening, and I'm sure the OWTU is listening. And they are saying, but the company in 2013 to 2017 wasn't doing too bad, using the definition of free cash flows, 270 million. And they're now listening and saying, for the next 5 years, using the same assumptions, we're into a negative 55. What is really happening? What are you trying to, and I want to be kind to the chair and my other colleagues, and to you, are you saying to the public that because I'm getting an impression that these numbers are not, these assumptions are not really realistic, because it's painting a kind of picture of Petrotrin in a very negative way. So help the public and myself understand.
Sure. So that was the first point, and I still don't think you can get away from that as a reality. The second point is, and I made this point in relation to the maintenance capex, specifically over the last 2 years, changing the tone of the refining and marketing free cash flows. The fact is that we have underspent. We've underspent in terms of capital expenditure, in terms of maintenance expenditure, turnaround expenditure. We've significantly underspent. Those things create tremendous risk going forward and cannot be sustained. So projecting forward, we have to assume that you spend on maintenance expenditure. We have to assume that we do the turnarounds that are required at the refinery. Those things were not included in actual expenditure over the last 5 years, but have to be included over the coming 5 years. So those change the picture dramatically.
Mr. Lee, I think that when the price of oil also during the earlier period would have yielded a greater benefit to Petrotrin out of than what is happening today. And that has also impacted, and I think that if somebody looked at it as a curve with the change of prices as it went down. Yeah?
I've been listening to the discussion, and I think I can summarize. I would have no difficulty if you would correct me. Using the definition here in this presentation, that free cash flow is earning before payment of interest, taxes, accounting for depreciation and amortization, less payment of royalties, less capital expenditure. What you are actually reflecting in your numbers is the actual capital expenditure that took place and the actual royalties that were paid.
That's correct.
Not what should have been paid.
Correct.
Or spent.
That's correct.
In either case.
Exactly.
So what in the company's books, they show free cash flow because they didn't pay royalties, even though the definition of free cash flow assumes the payment of 100% of royalties. So that's where the confusion is coming in. Am I correct?
Absolutely correct, yes.
All right. Well, I'm not sure everybody would understand that.
Sure.
Because one would assume that for accounting purposes, you would show royalties as an expense, even though you didn't pay it.
Sorry, go on.
Chairman, the problem is here in that you're looking at a presentation and you are trying to tie it into the accounting, and they're two separate directions. You're going to try and reconcile them as we go is going to be impossible. So,
Mr. Espini, but we have a duty because we have a public looking on at us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we always need to put it in a manner that we in the room and the public can understand. Isn't the proper analogy One, for example, you have $1,000 to spend for the month. You have a number of expenses. So, for example, your rent might be $500. Your travel might be $250. Your loan may be $300. So you've already exceeded the amount of, you only have $1,000 cash, but your expenses are already over the $1,000. All free cash flow does is look at how much money you spent out of your $1,000 for the month. So I decided, well, look, I had to pay my landlord this month. I paid them the $500. I had to travel, so I paid the $250. And with the remaining $250, look, tough. I ain't paying George that I owe money to. So now the free cash flow that would be reflected in that month would be $250, because that is the free amount of cash that you had at the end of the month. Isn't that the analogy?
So, Minister, if I could use your example, if I'm renting from my uncle for $500, and I decide he's a nice uncle, I won't pay him, but it's Carnival coming, so I need to pay. So I'll pay everything else, including Carnival, and I might have an extra $200 left. It's free cash, but I just haven't paid my uncle. So that's the analogy.
Can I just understand the term free cash flow? Has it to do anything with your credit rating?
Not directly. Free cash flow is simply a way of analyzing a company down to its most common denominator. Every company has to generate cash in order to pay its providers of capital. Therefore, it comes down to the ability of a company to generate cash.
It's a yardstick used by investors, any investor, whether or not it be of loan or debt capital or equity capital.
Looking at your obligations, your liabilities. So you're generating cash flow.
Yes.
But because you're not paying your debts.
Sure.
So you're not paying your debts, so you have more cash available to you.
Sure.
But in a projection, one never assumes that you're not going to do it. I mean, you may have had it in an actual application of funds, but in your assumption, when one looks at free cash flow in a going forward position, you don't assume that you're not going to do that.
Right. So what you're saying is that in the past, payments should have been made towards royalties and so
Absolutely,
on, and
yes.
capex,
Yeah.
but weren't.
Correct.
But this board intends to pay royalties and to spend money on capital expenditure.
And maintenance expenditure.
And maintenance, hence the reason why your free cash flow, which is now a third definition of free cash flow. This is now the new board of Petrotrin free cash flow, which means you pay your royalties and you invest in your plant and equipment.
Correct.
Would be less. You're free because you will be doing what you're supposed to do,
Correct.
which is to pay royalties and invest in your plant and equipment.
Yeah. Absolutely right, Chairman.
Yeah. Okay. Off at about 10 to 4, so we have 20 minutes. So can we move on with the presentation, please?
Sure. So, Chairman, I think I've covered this slide in respect of the stakeholders. So it's really just the one final consideration. So we've also, as the board, we've also been engaged in a number of things pointing to the future. In respect of governance, we've been trying to clarify as best we can the role between the shareholder and the board. We've had meetings with the representatives of the shareholder and continue to update them on where the operations of the company are, but to ensure that there's an arm's length separation between the shareholder and the board and the operations of the company. We've, as a board, have committed to the management, to the employees, to the unions, to the stakeholders, that we will continue to create an environment that allows the company to return to viability. And that includes providing the credibility of a set of board and leadership that will take us there, and to provide the space for the financiers. Structurally, we're presently engaged in formally separating the company into two separate and distinct business units, one for the upstream and one for the downstream. You may know, of course, that the Lashley Committee recommended 3 business units, and that included, in the upstream side, a separation between the land and the marine operations. We've made a decision. We'll separate between the 2 main business units there's nothing that stops us from doing a further separation within the E&P side of the business to one that focuses on marine and one that's on land. But what this does is it allows us to focus on the performance up to the level of the earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and the EBITDA. Give specific people specific accountability for generating EBITDA, and which will lead to positive free cash flows. And to install a transition team with the business unit heads that have those specific accountabilities for the performance of those operating results, and to ensure that the business units have the resources to fulfill their individual mandates. Operationally, we've gone a step further, and we're working with and encouraging the management and teams operationally to do a number of things. On the part of the board and requirement of the transition team will be to establish this prioritized plan of action that will return the company to sustainability. And that, of course, will feed into what we present to the providers of capital. Across the business units, we're asking the management and the employees to work collectively to identify a set of opportunities for and to implement operational improvements that will be consistent with getting into the first quartile operators. And we have been getting some feedback that some of the employees, the managers, are anxious to provide help. So some feedback is already starting to come through. Secondly, we're asking to identify some specific activities that are destroying value as they see it now through negative cash flows, and to remediate those activities. And finally, to identify opportunities for savings, whether those are through amended business practices, operational practices, or renegotiating with contractors and suppliers. And so those are some of the disciplines that we are enforcing and working with the teams to implement, all the way from the governance through to the operational requirements. And so in summary, that's a presentation. If you don't mind, I'll just ask the chairman to make some closing comments.
Closing on the presentation, but not closing on the meeting.
No, on the presentation.
Just to reinforce what Mr. Edwards has been saying, essentially there are two sets of assets that we have identified, that there's the possibility of putting them to use that could allow them to be viable. In doing that, that process is going to require substantial changes from the way that it is now being operated. That requires that the stakeholders, all the stakeholders, participate in those changes. Naturally, if one looks at it, the investments that are required to take this into the stage that we talk about of sustainability is going to be substantial. The financial requirements are substantial, and therefore, in order to do it, we have to be assured that we have a narrative that is going to be carried to the lenders or the financiers, whoever is financing, to give them the assurance that it can be repaid. Because as you will appreciate, no financier of any type, be it loan or equity capital, is going to be interested in chasing after something that is evidently not going to give a return. In fact, if it is that we continue as we are, it is undoubtedly unsustainable and in a very short term. So we are encouraging the stakeholders that are involved with us to participate in changing work practices, work habits, and to take on board the fact that the existence of Petrotrin in the future will be dependent on its ability to be competitive. And to be competitive, we have to be able to benchmark ourselves in line with what our competitors do. So our intention is going to be to meet with these and to use as a roadmap, a guideline, the benchmarking that has been established as to where we have to get in a 2-year period. that is going to be the challenge of the board as we go forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Espinay. You have a number of stakeholders, I would assume, as I sit here and think about it. One of your stakeholders are the public of Trinidad and Tobago, arguably are your shareholders. You have your workers who are represented by the union, and the union being OWTU. Your financiers, bondholders, potential financiers, etc., rating agencies, because your rating affects the country's sovereign rating, or your positioning has the potential to affect our sovereign rating. You've begun to engage your stakeholders, etc. The efficiencies that you need to achieve, because you keep talking about being competitive and competitive with your competitors. And as I sit here, it dawns on me, well, do we really know what it is you do? What is your output? We talk about the refinery. What is the output from the refinery? Where does that go? Who's the purchaser? Because that's one level of competition. What we've learned is your input is only a certain amount of production. You said you have 175,000 barrels a day. I think your production, is 43,000 and thereabouts, right? So what makes up, you've told us, is about 125,000 barrels you throughput a day. Where does that come from? What makes that up? What affects that, etc.? How have you engaged, if at all, your workers and the union, who I assume would be a critical input in assisting in your becoming competitive?
Minister, you named one of the unions that we have, and by far
they're the
most visible, and they certainly are the most vocal and the most prominent. We do have two other unions or representatives of certain parts of the employee base, which we have engaged all three of them. And the engagement that we have had so far is to make a presentation similar to what has been made, in fact, exactly as what has been made here, as we have done with the other association, of the staff association and the other union, with the intent of, first of all, having a conversation where we could bring to the forefront the predicament that we now find ourselves in. If we can establish where we are, then we are hoping that our conversation could then go into where we want to go and how we're going to get there.
Is it understood at these forums, and this really is an area with the Minister of Finance, but is it understood at these forums that, do they think that the government is going to provide a parachute?
Well, my personal position has been, and the board's position has been, that if one looked intelligently at the present status of Trinidad and Tobago and the finances of the government of Trinidad and Tobago, where we have been reducing our services in a number of areas and the support system has been shrinking, and where there are daily statements being made about various people who are being delayed in their payment systems, etc. Our position as a board has been that there is no way that we could expect to get support from the government.
Well, meaning a checkbook support.
Meaning financial support.
Right, correct.
And really, if viability is a possibility, then that is what we should be heading to, rather than looking at some alternative opportunity.
Okay.
Question, Mr. Espinay. Under future considerations, the slide is still up. Under structural considerations, do you have any timelines for these considerations, structural and operational? For example, the separation of into two business units. Do you have any clear timelines? Because I read on the newspapers I think today that the board was making these adjustments today. So I don't know, just for the viewing public.
Well, Mr. Lee, I think that the newspaper that they printed, and I read as well, that they recognized the departure of the president, and and that there was, at that stage, no pronouncement made about his replacement. And the board has been looking and will very soon make a definitive pronouncement on it, but the board has been looking at using this as the opportunity to go into the remodeling exercise that we have been talking about doing and focusing on the individual units. So the whole question as to what do you need as a management thing, that is, we will be, within a matter of a week, we will be coming up with a very clear, defined position on that.
Follow-up. When you say units, would it be units of Petrotrin or would it be separate companies?
Well, you know, Petrotrin has a legal commitments now that are not going to be, and we have to be extremely careful. At this stage, we are remodeling the way that we do the model that we currently operate. And that is not in any way a restructuring as is termed in financial circles. That has implications from our debtors, from our creditors, especially the financial creditors that are there, banks, etc., become extremely nervous because that impacts on securitization and all of that kind of issue. So we are mindful of that. And the first attempt is to get the operational structure in place, after which we will be looking at the financial, remodeling that is required to go with that. And as Mr. Edwards pointed out to you, in discussions with our financiers, we have indicated to them that in a period of 90 days, we would be coming back to them with something more definitive in terms of how we saw and you will appreciate that Petrotrin is a very large and complex organization. Doing some of these things is going to take a little bit of time.
Yeah, it's a question. Off your presentation, not off. Why, in the opinion of the board, does Petrotrin exist?
I wanted to tell you what has been discussed at our level, and one of the things is that we have inherited it. And like a lot of things that you inherit, you just don't change them. And we inherited it because there was a period, perhaps 70 or 100 years ago, that it functioned, but since then it has become obviously not strategically the same entity that it was then. So the question at this stage, the board's focus is that Petrotrin has a number of employees that are there and trying to ensure that the country continues to have a refinery, that the employees will be, we will maintain an employee base that is of good paying and skilled jobs, is part of the process of our thought processes.
Let me clarify the question. It's not that it should not exist. Of course, it must exist. I was just wondering what was your philosophy?
Well, there's also
the rationale for Petrotrin.
Well, also, Chairman, there's also this is a period of serious uncertainty. I don't think anybody could come up with long-term solutions to a lot of things. We are going into the change of regulations that are impacting on us having to spend on the ultra-low sulfur, that if we don't spend on it, we are closing down Petrotrin. So therefore, we have to get our employees on board with the necessary changes to get to this in order to be able to have a narrative to get our lenders on board. So we have to, before we could even get the investment into ultra-low sulfur, we are going to have to get buy-in from the employees and their representatives into using this competitive roadmap that has been established by the best-in-class presenters of it, and saying to them, but given that this is where we have to get there in a given period of time, then we could take that and go to the bank and say, this is what we have. We would like now to be able to borrow money to get the ultra-low sulfur working so that we could continue to operate Petrotrin refinery after 2020.
All right, let me see if I could crystallize my question. Petrotrin is the custodian of natural resources that belong to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, on land and in the sea, correct? So Petrotrin is a custodian of reserves of oil and gas that exist on land and sea. And therefore, Petrotrin exists for the purpose of monetizing these resources for the benefit of the population of Trinidad and Tobago. Is that a fair statement I've just made?
It is a fair assumption.
Okay.
It is a fair
and in
assumption.
what you are doing, you are trying to ensure that the resources that Petrotrin is the custodian of on behalf of the people of Trinidad and Tobago are monetized in the most efficient and productive manner, taking into account factors, social, economic, geographic factors while you do that. Is that correct?
Well, Chairman, we as a board have been extremely careful not to be entering into the realm of government of trying to take purely social things into consideration. And that is why, given the fact that we will only retain this refinery if it can go into a break-even phase. And that has to be how, it cannot be retained otherwise, because to say that we would go and have an additional $300 million put into the ultra-low sulfur that is only going to further burden the population at large and our shareholders, which is who we are protecting and representing, we can't possibly get into that phase, so that we need to get the participants in this process to buy into the fact that, listen, we can do it if it is that we will go down that road of competitiveness.
All right, let me just clarify something, because Mr. Edwards said something and you have now just said something. And I think the public needs to understand what you're saying. Again, correct me if I'm not saying the right thing. Are you saying that if Petrotrin does not complete the ultra-low sulfur diesel project, then the refinery becomes uncompetitive and the refinery becomes obsolete? Is that what you are saying?
In 2020, the new regulations in terms of the sulfur content of diesel comes into force. And without it, we will not be able to sustain the refinery. We'll have to look for some place, some market to sell it in, which is going to be obviously at discounted prices. And already we are not very efficient refiners. So that means that what you're saying is you're going to be losing even more money if you went in that direction.
So what you're saying, if you don't complete and commission that ultra-low sulfur diesel
by 2021,
project,
you'll be out of activity.
2021, you can no longer sell your diesel internationally.
You may be able to sell it
regionally.
in parts of Africa.
Yes, I know, but you may not be able to sell it internationally and regionally.
That's what I mean.
At a
Yes,
competitive
you
price.
would not be competitive. You would not be able to
So
sell
you'd
it
lose even more money.
within the context. That's
So
right,
the
considerably more.
current production of the refinery, the diesel that it currently produces, the product, would not be commercially viable except in unusual markets.
Well, it
where-
will not be commercially viable. Your term is really right. Viability meaning that you can make a profit out of it and you can sustain your...
So you're saying that in
your
order for the
involvement.
refinery to continue as a going concern,
We have to get the
you have to
ultra-low.
do the ultra-low sulfur project.
And that is $300 million US.
Right, okay, well, that's my last question. You all go ahead.
Question to Mr. Espini. I think on a previous meetings, Mr. Hayward, the outgoing president, had spoke vociferously about having that ultra-sulfur plant come on stream. But from an operational point of view, and I want to, for the viewing public, could you, Mr. Chairman Espini, give us, the public, a status of what is happening at ANV drilling? Because I read in the papers that the injunction has been lifted.
Mr. Lee.
I don't think that's sub judice.
I didn't say that. Don't preempt me, please. That's not part of the presentation, right? So, no, but it's not part of the presentation.
No, it's
right?
not.
So, can we just finish on the presentation? Could could I ask members, do you have any other? Because I have questions on the presentation that I would like to ask at another session, so go ahead.
Mr. Edwards, at this time, if you can, this ULSD plant, right, needs $300 million to complete, and we must get that, Petrotrin, I mean, must get that by 2021 in order to function properly.
It would have to be in production by 2021 in order
So
to
we have to
preserve our
complete it by
markets.
2021.
Correct.
And commission it. What was the initial cost of that ULSD plant?
You mean what was the initial projection to complete the initial?
Correct, without the cost overruns. That's the next question I'll ask you. The estimated cost of it was what?
There were projections.
The original projection when it started.
The very first projection was 112 million.
112, right?
112.
US.
Correct.
What is the cost that has, how much money Petrotrin has spent on that thus far as we speak?
421 million to date.
421. And we need another 300.
Correct.
So this project that was critical to the existence of Petrotrin at the time that it was started when?
2009.
2009. At 112 million US.
That was the original projection.
Is now ballooned to over 700 million US dollars.
Correct.
And within this limited period of time that Mr. Espinay has been the chairman, together with this new board that has been installed, these projections that you've made in order to achieve what you intend to achieve in refining and marketing and exploration and production, is it that these things have never been attempted by any previous board of Petrotrin?
I can tell you, so that study that I quoted from 2006, that study outlined some of the same things that we're talking about as things that ought to be done. I couldn't tell you based on history whether they were attempted or not, but I can tell you that I have not seen any evidence that they were successfully done.
And I know you've been there for a short period of time, but is it correct? Is it correct that you've, let me ask it a different way. Have you at all been able to find out, if attempts were made, what were the difficulties in implementing them, so that in your approach over the next 18 months, or in your attempts to achieve these objectives, you would frontally know exactly what are the problems that you are going to face in implementing them?
Senator Ramlin, one of the things that the Lashley Committee identified that was that created a serious amount of problems for implementation is the constant changing of the guards, both in terms of the boards and the management of Petrotrin, so that there was no continuity of management in one instance, and then even responsibility shifted from one person to the other. It would be likened to a contractor being removed from a job and a second contractor coming in, and then you have all the issues that you have with it, who is responsible. So that's the problem. It is that responsibility seems to have evaporated in the whole process.
All right, Mr. Espinay, I think we're running out of time. I think we'll have to have another session with you on some of the unanswered questions with respect to the, not that you didn't answer them, but we need to ventilate them a little more with respect to the points made in the presentation. So I would just like to say, Mr. Lee, there's a Privy Council decision with respect to AV oil. So it is sub judice. So I don't think this committee can discuss it. I think we'll have to discuss that in camera and then come back, because there is a recent Privy Council decision. I think just, I looked at it a week ago, and it has prevented Petrotrin, if my recollection is right, from proceeding with termination of the license, the contract, and all that sort of thing. So the matter is a live matter before a court, and I would not want us to discuss it until we deal with that, because there is a decision of the highest court on AV oil. I don't think we can discuss it. So what I'd like to do now is a wrap up, but I'd like, I don't know if Mr. Edwards or Mr. Espinay, can you summarize very briefly the way forward for Petrotrin in perhaps a couple minutes?
Sorry, Chair. As I explained to you, in a couple of minutes, what we are attempting to do is we are attempting to focus on the operational units and to bring those into efficiencies using, as we said, as the basis of that, the competitive benchmarking that has been brought to us by Solomon Associates. That means that over the next few weeks, we are going to be constantly meeting with the various stakeholders in an effort to get buy-in to it, because that is a necessary part of us getting financing into the ultra-low sulfur. Without that ultra-low sulfur, somebody is going to be, if we can't get buy-in on that, they're going to be effectively saying we don't want to have a refinery.
Thank you very much. And as I said, we will be meeting with you again, and we'll just go through some of the issues in the presentation in a little more detail. And then, unfortunately, we may have to meet with you again to deal with some of the matters that were left to be answered on the last occasion, where we were talking about things like asset integrity and things like that, and overtime and so on. So thank you very much for coming. And Mr. Lee, I just want to tell you that we have to discuss this sub judice matter. We need to understand as a committee exactly what we can discuss and what we cannot discuss. But certainly, from where I sit, it's a live issue, and we need to talk about it before we pose questions to Petrotrin in public. I don't have a view on it, but I accept to say that I know it's live and before court, and therefore we shouldn't really be talking about it. But we'll talk about that in camera. So thank you very much for coming to Petrotrin, and thank you very much for your responses. Thank you.